Thursday, believe it or not, that we were more than halfway through the semester. There are fewer days left in the semester than you have already attended, so that is somewhat good. We are to week 8 already. Last week was reviewing the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Glorious Revolution, playing the review game, and then taking that test. And as I said, that's still available until 3:15 today. There's 9 of the 16 in this part of period 6 that still need to take it. So you will want to get that done. You should have some time here at the end to be able to do that. This week, we're going to take a look at and give you a really, really broad overview of the French Revolution. And so the French Revolution is important really for 3 reasons. One, it sort of picks up on the idea of the American Revolution, and you will focus a lot of your U.S. history class as a junior on the American Revolution and the things that go on there. But the big thing about that is the ideals, the rights of citizens of a particular country, and in terms of their idea of popular sovereignty. And so that is one reason that the French Revolution is really, really big. 2, the French Revolution is huge because at the time it is the most populous country in Europe. It is very, very Catholic, and so it's tied to the Pope, which was a little bit different than the Glorious Revolution. And this is the first time really that when you look at, lastly, when you look at a revolution, this is one of the first examples in Europe and really changes the trajectory of Europe for a couple of centuries, because this revolution is really directed at the monarchy. And so when you look at the Glorious Revolution, right, it was a battle between monarchs who might be Catholic, monarchs who might be Anglican. And so it was more a battle about religion used to, right, gain control. This is a battle about the rights of people and how they should be ruled. So we'll explain first, probably most importantly, the views of the 5 famous philosophers of the time period regarding rights and things that governments, monarchs, kings, queens, whoever's in charge should be doing for their people. Understand, right, the French Revolution is important because it sort of gives a guide to those who are going to use this as an example in revolutions later in Europe, as well as a warning, right, to some monarchs in terms of what happens. And then the document that comes out of that, similar to what we have with our Bill of Rights, right, our Constitution, the first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. The French come up with a document called the Declaration of Rights of Man and of Citizen. And it goes back to this Roman ideal, right, of the 12 tablets we talked about at the beginning of the semester, where when you write laws down, you can apply them equitably and fairly to people, but you also have protection, because once the laws and rights are written down, you can point to something and have that protected. And so they're going to force the king of France to be able to do that as well. There'll be an assignment over the French Revolution, just a basic outline of sort of the causes, the events, and the ramifications of that. I want you to see what Europe looks like in 1790. The revolution really starts in 89, been building up for almost 2 decades. There'll be a review game, and then you'll take a test later next week over that, and we will then move on to Napoleon next. So in your Canvas, you can go to Module 8 and then go ahead and click on this page, which gets to the Philosopher Notes. So you want to get to this second page into the Week 8 module. Okay, so As I said, I won't spend a lot of time talking about the American Revolution. Most of you had that either 7th or 8th grade of your junior high years, and you understand the basis of that. The French Revolution is a worldwide example, sort of a similar idea, that the people of France, after seeing what had happened with the colonies and the King of Britain, also understanding too, right, that France and Britain for a number of centuries have not gotten along and have fought wars. And the reason being, at least in this recent time here in the 1780s, 1790s, is the Glorious Revolution in England, right, where they chopped the head off of a Catholic king, and France being heavily Catholic, still tied to the Roman Catholic Church, was not happy about that. And so you have these battles and wars going on between the French and the British for a number of years. It's really not until you see a common threat in World War I and World War II that sort of France and Britain decide, hey, the enemy that is attacking us both is probably more dangerous than each other. And so that sort of stops the centuries-old fight between those two. So these philosophers that I've listed here are really world famous, but especially during this time period famous because of the ideals that they are portraying to normal citizens. And then we talked about the Gutenberg movable type printing press a couple of units ago. And so that's been around for a couple of hundred years. So the spread of the written word, whether it's in French, whether it's in Latin, whatever language, German, has spread throughout Europe. And so you have more and more of the populace, the people living in certain areas, that are able to read these ideas. So you have John Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Voltaire, and Wollstonecraft. John Locke is very famous in the American Revolution in terms of providing a blueprint that Thomas Jefferson uses in the Declaration of Independence about natural rights, that you are born, right, with these natural rights. And Locke makes the argument that, look, you are born with the right to life, the right to liberty, which was what we would consider freedom. And he also makes the argument that you have the right to property, right? So at this time, most of the world is still very agrarian. We haven't really hit the Industrial Revolution yet. And so most of the people, the only way that they can survive is to have a plot of land in which they can grow food and raise livestock for meat to be able to survive. And so these are the arguments that he makes. Montesquieu goes back to those ancient Greek and Roman ideals about the separation of powers, right? A republican form of government. And that's what the United States sets up with the three branches of government, right? The executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch. Each of those have checks and balances over the other two. And so Montesquieu talks about, look, you can have an evil king or an evil queen, but if we have checks and powers like they do in Britain, right, where the parliament can either approve or disapprove of a monarch's tax proposal or increase in taxes, we can check that. And so he makes arguments for this separation of power. Rousseau's biggest complaint is this idea of individual freedom, that the individual freedom or the freedom of the individual is more important than government control. And if you give people individual freedom, they will use that to their best of ability, and society will be greater for that instead of being oppressed, is the argument that he makes, by a government or by a monarch. Voltaire is probably one of the most famous novelists of all time during this time period, and also still quite a number of his novels are purchased to this day. And he is big on the freedom of thought and expression. And his novels illustrate that through the writings that he does. But people and citizens should be allowed the freedom to express their thoughts, whether speaking or writing, is the argument he makes. And then Wollstonecraft takes all of these philosophers and basically says, you know what, you talk about the rights of man and you talk about the rights of basically males in society, but what about equality for women? So why don't women have the same equality of freedom and life and liberty and property? Why don't women have the right to vote in a free society? And so she starts the movement for equal rights for women. And so it's during this time period where, when things start to go bad in France, and we'll illustrate that for you in a second, that people will start to point to Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau, Voltaire, and Wollstonecraft and say, look, we've already got a blueprint. We see what happened in America. We see what happened with the colonies. We've already got a blueprint on how we can make changes to the society. And that's what you're going to have happen in France. So go ahead and go to the next page. And I want to show you a 30-second clip here about the French Revolution. Then we'll start talking about the causes. Okay, I'm going to turn this up so you can hear it. Like I said, this is only going to last 30 seconds here.
The most glorious kingdom in Europe will face a mighty foe, the power of its own people. One man would rise to inspire the nation, to cast aside a reluctant king and a hated queen, and a new republic would be born in blood, the blood of the French Revolution.
All right, so one of the things about this is, and I said, it is somewhat horrifying, honestly, to a number of people in Europe as to what happens during the French Revolution. But there are basically three main causes to this. One is the involvement and extravagant spending by King Louis XVI and his predecessor that lead to the brink of bankruptcy. And I'm going to show you a short video clip and a panoramic photo of his palace. It's really an estate. It is the biggest building that I have ever seen in my life. I was there in April of 2019 at the Palace of Versailles. The second cause, you're going to have over 2 decades of drought and poor harvests. And why that is important is that the French staple and diet is bread. And if you are unable, right, to grow wheat and harvest wheat to create the flour to make the bread, you're going to have problems in that society. And also understand, as I said earlier, that France is the most populous country in Europe at the time period. And then lastly, to make up for the lack of poor harvests, and we still, during this time period of the late 1780s, 1790s, have a feudal system in France. And basically you have 3 levels of society. Society is divided into 3 levels. The aristocrats and the priests are at the highest level of French society, and they are called the first estate. The second estate is made up of the nobles, and the third estate is made up of the peasants. And remember, the peasants work the land and give part of their profits to the noble. The noble gives part of their profits to the aristocrats. The aristocrats give part of their profits that they have collected all the way from the third estate to the Catholic Church and the priests. And as the burden of France almost being bankrupt, the heavy taxes sort of push people over the edge. And so what I want to show you here is what this palace looks like. And you can look up pictures here, but for the most part, this is what you're looking at. And so let me show you this short clip here. The Palace of Versailles is about 16 miles southwest of the center of Paris. And obviously, you know, in the 1700s, there were no trains, there were no buses, there were no cars to get out there. So it was a ways out there. I'm standing basically at the front or the entrance of the palace, and the view is basically to the west. Now, these side buildings, just to get an idea of what's going on, these side buildings here are for the servants of the king and the queen and the royal family. And you can see how big that building is there. Now, in terms of the architecture of the Renaissance, right, I showed you that short clip about Peter Weller talking about the underground delivery of water in Florence and Italy. You can see the Greek and the Roman influences on the columns there and on the designs at this palace for Versailles. But basically, this is where the king and the queen and the royal family would live and stay. There are a number of gardens that are very famous. If you go out, basically there's a spot, if you go this way between these buildings, back behind on the other side of these buildings, there are huge gardens. And when you hear stories about King Louis XVI and the hunting that he does, that is back towards that area, which at the time I'm sure was mostly forest. I mean, it is pretty heavily vegetated there. But I'll show you the short clip, and then I'll show you a panoramic photo that I took from the front as well. And you can get the idea and the size and understand why people who might be starving, right, would be upset about the way that the king spends money and the way that the royal family lives. All right, so that's just a short clip, but let me show you a panoramic photo. You'll be a little easier to tell here. I'll try to increase this to full screen. So a couple of things that was really, really noticeable off the front. One is the architecture, right? The architecture, the columns, the basically influence of the Renaissance from Rome and Greece. The detail on the buildings. Now, the most amazing part, and you'll see this across the top here of the main palace, this is the main entrance. This is the gate here to get into the palace. If you look at all of that, that is gold. It's solid gold. It's unbelievable. And the main palace, as you go through there, as I said, through that building, you can see it a little better in the picture here. You can go in between these buildings, and that's where Marie Antoinette's garden was, back there in the back. But these side buildings here that are huge, and you can see the number of people waiting in line to get into this palace. I mean, you've got hundreds of people lined up here, and you can see that it stretches past this building. So that gives you an idea about how magnificent in terms of size those buildings are. And then this would be cobblestone, same thing you would expect to see in that time period in terms of ancient Rome. So that gives you a visual idea about what you're looking at in terms of the royal family and how they are living their life. So you have those three things going against the king and the royal family at the time. And so as things really start to get bad, the king allows for basically what's called an Estates General. And an Estates General had been periodically called. It is basically a meeting of all three states, the first estate, a second estate, and third estate. And this had been going on for almost 150 years periodically. When the Estates General is called, it is only because of pressure put on the king to call this meeting. And basically what had happened was there were people from the second and third estate who did not like the taxes that were proposed by the king. And so you had the general controller who proposed basically, you know what, let's put this tax on the rich, right? Same sort of argument that you hear today, right? Let's tax the millionaires and billionaires in the United States and use that money to help people who are not as well off. Well, they had the same idea in France in the late 1780s. Now, what you need to understand is that each estate got a vote. So the first estate filled of Catholic priests and aristocrats, Second estate was filled of the nobles. The third estate was basically the peasants of society of France. They made up 98% of the French population, but only got 33% of the vote. Each estate gets one vote. So obviously the aristocrats and the Catholic priests are not going to vote for a tax increase on them. The second estate, right, can see sort of the writing on the wall. If we vote with the third estate to put a tax on the first estate is going to join with the third estate, right, and put a tax on us. So they vote no. Well, this causes resentment in the third estate. It causes unrest with the 98% of the population who do not have enough bread, who do not have enough food, and there are going to start being riots and protests about the lack of food. So the king then, even though he agreed to this meeting of the Estates General, which is all three levels, basically says, you know what, we're going to combine all three estates into one for this assembly so that the third estate cannot be outvoted. And that starts a big debate. And so the revolts start when things start to take too long, because the assembly agrees on the consolidation, and they agree to meet at the Palace of Versailles. And after a month, there is no progress. And as the food shortages continue in Paris, which is the most populous city in Europe at the time period, the third estate basically storms the Bastille. And the Bastille is basically just a warehouse of gunpowder and weapons for the French army in that sector of Paris. And this is probably, I would say, about 20 miles back towards Paris. The Bastille would be just off center. It would be just east and south of the center of Paris if you thought about the Eiffel Tower and the Arc of Triumph and that area. So it's probably 22, maybe 24 miles from Versailles. Well, on July 14, 1789, the first shots of the revolution are fired because the soldiers at the Bastille obviously want to protect the gunpowder and the weapons and don't want these peasants to have control of that, but the peasants basically just overwhelm everybody. The hysteria and action that the peasants cause in terms of looting and burning homes of nobles and tax collectors after they get control of these weapons and the gunpowder to use basically causes what's known in France as the Great Fear. And the Great Fear in France is basically the fact that shots have been fired and all of the first estate, the Catholic priests and the aristocrats, leave the country. So they know what had happened with the Glorious Revolution. They saw what happened when the Anglicans started turning on the Catholics and the Catholics started turning on the Anglicans. And the Catholic priests and the aristocrats basically just say, you know what, I'm not going to wait to see what happens. They're not killing me. We're out of here. And so this becomes known as the Great Fear in France. The first shots of the revolution have been fired. The peasants now have control of weapons and gunpowder. It's 98% of the population. They are starving. They're unhappy with the tax situation, and they don't think things are going to get better before they get much, much worse. So the Great Fear of July and August will turn into September and October, and basically everybody in the First Estate is going to leave France. August 4th, the Assembly approves this rights of man, right? The rights of man and of citizen. And so during the Great Fear is going to last for about 3 to 4 months. It's going to be July 14, 1789 through November of 1789. The violence only gets worse because the bread shortages get much more drastic. And the city of Paris, as I said, is the most populous city in Europe. There's not enough food to feed everybody. The Estates General, that assembly, is not making any progress on what to do. And basically in 1789, the people that had taken the weapons and the gunpowder from the Bastille go ahead and they start marching on the palace at Versailles. They take the king, the queen, the family, all the servants that are in that palace and basically drag them back to the center of Paris and basically what we would consider house arrest. They're put into a location and they're not allowed to go anywhere or do anything. And basically the assembly then creates this rights of man and of citizen. And they just take it to the king and say, you're going to sign this, right? The king doesn't have control of the army anymore. The king doesn't have control really of the country anymore, more of a figurehead. And so this rights of man approved by the National Assembly at this Estates General sweeps away the feudal aspects of French society. So no longer will the peasants in the third estate have to pay the nobles in the second estate, which will then funnel money up to the first estate. So in theory, this document is going to create equality in France. And that is one of the battle cries of this revolution. And they use the French word for equality many times. The National Assembly then takes over the Catholic Church because all the priests are gone. There's nobody there to stop them. So they go into the Catholic churches all throughout France, and especially throughout Paris. They grab any of the gold, any of the possessions of value, and in even some cases, they just take the church and the land that the church owns and sells that off to pay for food shortages of the third estate. Now, after this continues for many months, the king realizes this isn't going well. And the king starts making plans to leave. His wife is Austrian, of Austrian descent, and Austria is very Catholic as well, has a monarchy that is very sympathetic to him. And so he starts making plans and thinks about leaving France to hopefully avoid the same fate as Charles I of England, right? The Catholic king that has his head chopped off. The problem is that many of his supporters had already left because they believe France to be unsafe. So there's nobody in the first estate left to help him and to try to get him safe passage to Austria. The king waits almost a year before he and his family try to flee to Austria. And they try to leave in the middle of the night. The indecision and the delay in the plan causes his capture near the northeastern border with Austria. And the carriage obviously is a telltale sign when the French soldiers at the border are going to either allow or not allow he and his family safe passage. When they ask him to step out of the carriage, it is obvious from his shoes and just his manner of dress that this is the king. And so they basically rearrest him. They take him back to Paris, and he is not going to be released again. He is basically now going to be imprisoned for trying to flee the country. And the twist and the turn is that it is not going to end well for him. After they catch him, 2 months later, they basically make him sign a document that says, you are no longer full monarch and full controller of France. We now have a limited constitutional monarchy. So we are going to have a National Assembly. We're going to have a new legislative body, and we are going to dictate to you what we want done for all of this. And so then that gets us pretty much to the end. As this has continued from 1789 through 1790 into 1791, other countries run by monarchs in Europe are worried. They're extremely worried about this because word has gotten out that rioters have taken over the palace, that rioters have put the royal family on house arrest, that rioters wouldn't let them flee the country and have now imprisoned them. With the opening there and the ties to Austria because of Marie Antoinette, Austria and Prussia, both ruled by monarchs, declare war on France because there's nobody left to help the king. And when the war is declared, Austria and Prussia very organized. There is nobody really in charge in France. The war starts out extremely bad for the French. The Austrians and the Prussians are about 18 miles northeast of Paris. If they can get to Paris and take over Paris, they are going to take control of France. This scare allows a radical group of the Third Estate, known as the Jacobins, led by Robespierre, to take control. He immediately, when England, Holland, and Spain try to join the war against France with the Austrians and Prussians, makes a call to all of the peasants and said, we're about to be taken over. We need you to join the army. And France, being the most populous country in Europe, basically has 800,000 volunteers come to the aid of France. And this is where we'll get into Napoleon next week, but under some good direction, they are able to fend off these 5 countries and basically force them back out of France. And Robespierre is seen as a hero for organizing this battle and this defense of the country. Now, obviously, the conspiracy theorists say, you know what? King Louis somehow convinced Marie Antoinette's family and monarchy in Austria and friends in Prussia to try to get him out of jail and force, right, this basic incursion, right, into France. And so what happens is Robespierre puts King Louis on trial for treason, saying that he aided and abetted Austria in this war against France. Trial does not last very long at all. King Louis XVI is found guilty. When you're found guilty of treason, almost every punishment in every country of the world is execution. So early in the morning, in January of 1793, the king is brought out to the city of Paris and basically put in the guillotine and has his head chopped off. This is going to start a reign of terror, and what is known as the Reign of Terror. Because after Robespierre has the king executed, he is going to start going after people he thinks are sympathetic to First Estate, Second Estate, or anybody that might be sympathetic to the king. And so you're going to have dozens, if not hundreds of people executed every day at the guillotine, which is that tall wooden structure with a metal blade that comes down and chops your head off. It was supposed to be seen as humane. Dr. Guillotine is the one that designed that, and that's why they named the execution device after him. Robespierre is going to basically take control of France for the Jacobins, which is a radical part of the Third Estate. Peasants, priests, and members of the émigré, which was one of the levels of the First Estate and Second Estate, become outraged, and they start to leave and cannot believe that this is what it has turned into. Now, the Reign of Terror basically is an attempt to wipe out all parts of France's old system or monarchy. Robespierre names himself leader of the Committee for Public Safety and basically charges himself with deciding who is an enemy of France and who is a friend of France. He eventually, about 6 weeks, or 6 months, excuse me, after the king is executed, Robespierre has the queen executed. And so they are just going through methodically and taking care of anybody who might try to make a claim to go back on this constitutional monarchy. In July of 1794, members of the National Convention turn on Robespierre and execute him because Robespierre had started getting paranoid about who and what were going to come after him. And people could see where this was going. I mean, this reign of terror lasted good portion of a year and a half. And it was just execution after execution. And people were turning in their neighbors or saying their neighbors were sympathetic, and they would just be hauled off, a sham trial and then executed the next day. By 1795, everything had calmed down. The moderates had drafted a new plan of government. They created a 2-house legislature in France. They create a 5-man executive body called the Directory, and they allow for a new general. And that's where Napoleon is going to come in. But the 5-man executive body is so that no one person like Robespierre can become so powerful that they would be able to cause trouble. So go ahead and click on next and I'll talk to you a little bit about the document that comes out of that, the rights of man and of citizen, and compare that to the American document. So go ahead and click to that page. Okay, so one of the big documents that comes out, and this will be a guide to other places in Europe, and it has its influences from the American Declaration of Independence, is this Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen. And basically, the Declaration was influenced by the Enlightenment ideals that we've talked about before in previous units, and also the American Declaration of Independence, which you know, or should know, right, was written by Thomas Jefferson. General Lafayette, who worked with Thomas Jefferson when he was a diplomat in France for the United States during this time period, helped to draft this document. And the foundation of the document is in the natural rights of man that Locke wrote. And it asserts basically, its biggest premise is it asserts this idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that government gets its right to rule from the people. And the people alone are the only ones that give the government the right to do that, right? We don't have monarchs that have divine rights from God, as argued in previous decades and centuries. The idea of popular sovereignty also says, look, if the government is wrong, if the government is evil, if the government is denying rights, it's also the duty of each citizen to change the government. And so it sets up this idea about active and passive citizenship. And that is what is in that document. So it goes a little farther than the Declaration of Independence, but it has its foundations from that document of Thomas Jefferson. And remember, right, the basic principles of the American Declaration of Independence from a couple of decades earlier, all people are created equal, right, comes from John Locke. All people have basic rights that cannot be taken away. This idea comes from John Locke and is put into the French document as well. The government gets its power to make its decisions and to protect rights from the people. That's the idea of popular sovereignty. That is also in the French document. When the government does not protect the rights of the people have the right to change or remove the government. And that is also in this French document. And it's an important thing going forward the next couple of centuries. Go ahead and click next here, and I'll show you what you need to do before we meet again next Friday. Okay, so couple of things, three things we're going to have you do. This French Revolution worksheet is basically just an overview of everything that I gave, which is a very broad explanation of the French Revolution, what it means, particularly for France, but also for the rest of Europe, because it really changes the course of Europe during this time period. Questions like, what were the three classes of French society, right? You guys know that. First estate, second estate, third estate. The three factors that led to the revolution, right? The overspending of the king, the heavy taxes, the food shortages, all of those things, right, are very simple. So in Go Formative, it'll be the same submission that you'll have before. So you'll fill in your answer, right? First estate, second estate, third estate. After you hit submit, you'll copy and paste your URL here. If I go to a student view, this will show you. Right. So click on your blue submission button. After you submit and go formative, you can put your URL in your text entry, or you can do a website URL, or you can upload a screenshot or two of the assignment. When you hit submit, that'll notify me that you are finished with that. As I said, I wanted you to see what Europe looks like during the time of the French Revolution, because it's going to be important to understand as we move into the time of Napoleon, and then the empire Napoleon creates, and then what they do after Napoleon. And so that's just a simple map exercise. There are your identifications right there. I believe there are 19. So you'll use that map here, right, just to fill in that information there. You can copy, right? Don't waste your time. But on yours, you'll be able to highlight this area, copy it, paste that in where it goes. Same thing after you've submitted this with your submit button down here, copy this URL, and the submission process is the same as any Go formative. All right, so you can submit there, or you can submit here, submit that assignment, and you are set. Then lastly, what I have is I have a review game for the French Revolution. You may also, if you would rather, and it's really completely up to you, but if you're more a visual learner, I know things aren't exactly the way we would want them to be. This here is one of the better documentaries. Let me go to the next page. And it is pretty exciting. It's pretty cool watching Robespierre and all that. But this video here covers that entire, from the Great Fear through the Reign of Terror to what happens at the end. Shows the king getting his head chopped off, Marie Antoinette, etc., but also highlights the hysteria. So if you'd rather watch that video, or even in conjunction with that, that would be good for you to review. And then the last thing that you need to do after you are ready, whether it be through the review game, through the video, or a combination of them, is there is an assessment over the French Revolution. Again, you can use this as many times as you want. The questions on the review game are also on your test, but then you'll load this in there just as you've done before. It'll be your 6-digit student number and your network or tablet password is what will go there, and it will show you, of course I spelled network wrong, that can't be good. It will show you the assessment that'll be available to you. Also, as I said, the 9 of you who have not taken test 2 yet, that's still available until 3:15 today. So you want to make sure that that is done. That started showing